This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Williams. Bulfinch's Mythology, The Age of Fable, by Thomas Bulfinch. Chapter 31. Adventures of Aeneas, the Harpies, Dido, Palinurus. Adventures of Aeneas. We have followed one of the Grecian heroes, Ulysses, in his wanderings on his return home from Troy, and now we propose to share the fortunes of the remnant of the conquered people under their chief Aeneas, in their search for a new home after the ruin of their native city. On that fatal night, when the wooden horse disgorged its contents of armed men, and the capture and conflagration of the city were the result, Aeneas made his escape from the scene of the destruction, with his father and his wife and young son. The father, Anchises, was too old to walk with the speed required, and Aeneas took him upon his shoulders. Thus burdened, leading his son and followed by his wife, he made the best of his way out of the burning city, but, in the confusion, his wife was swept away and lost. On arriving at the place of rendezvous, numerous fugitives of both sexes were found who put themselves under the guidance of Aeneas. Some months were spent in preparation, and at length they embarked. They first landed on the neighboring shores of Thrace, and were preparing to build a city, but Aeneas was deterred by a prodigy. Preparing to offer sacrifice, he tore some twigs from one of the bushes. To his dismay, the wounded part dropped blood. When he repeated the act, a voice from the ground cried out to him, "Spare me, Aeneas. I am your kinsman, Polydore, here murdered with many arrows, from which a bush has grown, nourished with my blood." These words recalled to the recollection of Aeneas that Polydore was a young prince of Troy, whom his father had sent with ample treasures to the neighboring land of Thrace, to be there brought up, at a distance from the horrors of war. The king to whom he was sent had murdered him and seized his treasures. Aeneas and his companions, considering the land accursed by the stain of such a crime, hastened away. They next landed on the island of Delos, which was once a floating island till Jupiter fastened it by adamantine chains to the bottom of the sea. Apollo and Diana were born there, and the island was sacred to Apollo. Here Aeneas consulted the oracle of Apollo and received an answer, ambiguous as usual. "Seek your ancient mother. There the race of Aeneas shall dwell, and reduce all other nations to their sway." The Trojans heard with joy, and immediately began to ask one another, "Where is the spot intended by the oracle?" Anchises remembered that there was a tradition that their forefathers came from Crete, and thither they resolved to steer. They arrived at Crete and began to build their city, but sickness broke out among them, and the fields that they had planted failed to yield a crop. In this gloomy aspect of affairs, Aeneas was warned in a dream to leave the country and seek a western land, called Hesperia, whence Dardanus, the true founder of the Trojan race, had originally migrated. To Hesperia, now called Italy, therefore they directed their future course, and not till after many adventures in the lapse of time sufficient to carry a modern navigator several times around the world did they arrive there. Their first landing was at the island of the Harpies. These were disgusting birds with the heads of maidens, with long claws and faces pale with hunger. They were sent by the gods to torment a certain Phineus, whom Jupiter had deprived of his sight in punishment of his cruelty. And whenever a meal was placed before him, the Harpies darted down from the air and carried it off. They were driven away from Phineus by the heroes of the Argonautic expedition, and took refuge in the island where Aeneas now found them. When they entered the port, the Trojans saw herds of cattle roaming over the plain. They slew as many as they wished and prepared for a feast. But no sooner had they seated themselves at the table than a horrid clamor was heard in the air, and a flock of these odious harpies came rushing down upon them, seizing in their talons the meat from the dishes and flying away with it. Aeneas and his companions drew their swords and dealt vigorous blows among the monsters, but to no purpose, for they were so nimble it was almost impossible to hit them, and their feathers were just like armor, impenetrable to steel. One of them, perched on a neighboring cliff, screamed out, "Is it thus, Trojans, you treat us innocent birds, first slaughter our cattle and then make war on ourselves?" She then predicted dire sufferings to them in their future course, and having vented her wrath flew away. The Trojans made haste to leave the country, and next found themselves coasting along the shore of Epirus. Here they landed, and to their astonishment learned that certain Trojan exiles, who had been carried there as prisoners, had become rulers of the country. Andromache, the widow of Hector, became the wife of one of the victorious Grecian chiefs, to whom she bore a son. Her husband dying, she was left regent of the country as guardian of her son, and had married a fellow captive, Helenus, of the royal race of Troy. Helenus and Andromache treated the exiles with the utmost hospitality, and dismissed them loaded with gifts. From hence Aeneas coasted along the shore of Sicily, and passed the country of the Cyclops. Here they were hailed from the shore by a miserable object, whom by his garments, tattered as they were, they perceived to be a Greek. He told them he was one of Ulysses' companions, left behind by that chief in his hurried departure. He related the story of Ulysses' adventure with Polyphemus, and besought them to take him off with them, as he had no means of sustaining his existence where he was but wild berries and roots, and lived in constant fear of the Cyclops. While he spoke, Polyphemus made his appearance, a terrible monster, shapeless, vast, whose only eye had been put out. He walked with cautious steps, feeling his way with a staff down to the seaside, to wash his eye socket in the waves. When he reached the water, he waded out towards them, and his immense height enabled him to advance far into the sea, so that the Trojans, in terror, took to their oars to get out of his way. Hearing the oars, Polyphemus shouted after them, so that the shores resounded, and at the noise the other Cyclops came forth from their caves and woods and lined the shores, like a row of lofty pine trees. The Trojans plied their oars, and soon left them out of sight. Aeneas had been cautioned by Helenus to avoid the strait guarded by the monsters Scylla and Charybdis. There Ulysses, the reader will remember, had lost 6 of his men, seized by Scylla, while the navigators were wholly intent upon avoiding Charybdis. Aeneas, following the advice of Helenus, shunned the dangerous pass, and coasted along the island of Sicily. Juno, seeing the Trojans speeding their way prosperously towards their destined shore, felt her old grudge against them revive, for she could not forget the slight that Paris had put upon her, in awarding the prize of beauty to another. In heavenly minds can such resentment dwell. Accordingly she hastened to Aeolus, the ruler of the winds, the same who had supplied Ulysses with favoring gales, giving him the contrary ones tied up in a bag. Aeolus obeyed the goddess, and sent forth his sons, Boreas, Typhon, and the other winds, to toss the ocean. A terrible storm ensued, and the Trojans were driven out of their course towards the coast of Africa. There they were in imminent danger of being wrecked, and were separated, so that Aeneas thought that all were lost except his own. At this crisis, Neptune, hearing the storm raging, and knowing that he had given no orders for one, raised his head above the waves, and saw the fleet of Aeneas driving before the gale. Knowing the hostility of Juno, he was at no loss to account for it, but his anger was not the less at this interference in his province. He called the winds and dismissed them with a severe reprimand. He then soothed the waves and brushed away the clouds from before the face of the sun. Some of the ships which had got on the rocks he pried off with his own trident, while Triton and a sea nymph, putting their shoulders under others, set them afloat again. The Trojans, when the sea became calm, sought the nearest shore, which was the coast of Carthage, where Aeneas was so happy as to find that one by one the ships all arrived safe, though badly shaken. Waller, in his panegyric to the Lord Protector, Cromwell, alludes to the stilling of the storm by Neptune. Above the waves, as Neptune showed his face, to chide the winds and save the Trojan race, so has your Highness raised above the rest storms of ambition tossing us repressed. Dido. Carthage, where the exiles had now arrived, was a spot on the coast of Africa opposite Sicily, where at that time a Tyrian colony under Dido, their queen, were laying the foundations of a state destined in later ages to be the rival of Rome itself. Dido was the daughter of Belus, king of Tyre, and the sister of Pygmalion, who succeeded his father on the throne. Her husband was Sichaeus, a man of immense wealth, but Pygmalion, who coveted his treasures, caused him to be put to death. Dido, with a numerous body of friends and followers, both men and women, succeeded in effecting their escape from Tyre in several vessels, carrying with them the treasures of Sichaeus. On arriving at the spot which they had selected as the seat of their future home, they asked of the natives only so much land as they could enclose with a bull's hide. When this was readily granted, she caused the hide to be cut into strips, and with them enclosed a spot on which she built a citadel, and called it Byrsa, a hide. Around this fort the city of Carthage rose, and soon became a powerful and flourishing place. Such was the state of affairs when Aeneas and his Trojans arrived there. Dido received the illustrious exiles with friendliness and hospitality. "Not unacquainted with distress," she said, "I have learned to succor the unfortunate." The queen's hospitality displayed itself in festivities at which games of strength and skill were exhibited. The strangers contended for the palm with her own subjects on equal terms, the queen declaring that whether the victor were Trojan or Tyrian, it should make no difference to her. At the feast which followed the games, Aeneas gave at her request a recital of the closing events of Trojan history, and his own adventures after the fall of the city. Dido was charmed with his discourse, and filled with admiration of his exploits. She conceived an ardent passion for him, and he, for his part, seemed well content to accept the fortunate chance which appeared to offer him at once a happy termination of his wanderings, a home, a kingdom, and a bride. Months rolled away in the enjoyment of pleasant intercourse, and it seemed as if Italy and the empire destined to be founded on its shores were alike forgotten. Seeing which, Jupiter dispatched Mercury with a message to Aeneas recalling him to a sense of his high destiny, and commanding him to resume his voyage. Aeneas parted from Dido, though she tried every allurement and persuasion to detain him. The blow to her affection and her pride was too much for her to endure, and when she found that he was gone, she mounted a funeral pile, which she had caused to be erected, and having stabbed herself was consumed with the pile. The flames, rising over the city, were seen by the departing Trojans, and, though the cause was unknown, gave to Aeneas some intimation of the fatal event. The following epigram we find in elegant extracts from the Latin. Unhappy, Dido, was thy fate, in first and second married state. One husband caused thy flight by dying, thy death the other caused by flying. Palinurus. After touching at the island of Sicily, where Acestes, a prince of Trojan lineage, bore sway, who gave them a hospitable reception, the Trojans re-embarked, and held on their course for Italy. Venus now interceded with Neptune to allow her son at last to attain the wished-for goal, and find an end to his perils on the deep. Neptune consented, stipulating only for one life as ransom for the rest. The victim was Palinurus, the pilot. As he sat watching the stars with his hand on the helm, Somnus, sent by Neptune, approached in the guise of Phorbas, and said, Palinurus, the breeze is fair, the water smooth, and the ship sails steadily on her course. Lie down a while, and take needful rest. I will stand at the helm in your place. Palinurus replied, Tell me not of smooth seas or favoring winds. Me, who has seen so much of their treachery, shall I trust Aeneas to the chances of the weather and the winds? And he continued to grasp the helm, and to keep his eyes fixed on the stars. But Somnus waved over him a branch moistened with Lethean dew, and his eyes closed in spite of all his efforts. Then Somnus pushed him overboard, and he fell, but keeping his hold upon the helm, it came away with him. Neptune was mindful of his promise, and kept the ship on her track without helm or pilot, till Aeneas discovered his loss, and, sorrowing deeply for his faithful steersman, took charge of the ship himself. There is a beautiful allusion to the story of Palinurus in Scott's Marmion, Introduction to Canto I, where the poet, speaking of the recent death of William Pitt, says, Oh, think how, to his latest day, when death just hovering claimed his prey, with Palinur's unaltered mood, firm at his dangerous post he stood, each call for needful rest repelled, with dying hand the rudder held, till in his fall with fateful sway the steerage of the realm gave way. The ships at last reached the shores of Italy, and joyfully did the adventurers leap to land. While his people were employed in making their encampment, Aeneas sought the abode of the Sibyl. It was a cave connected with a temple and a grove, sacred to Apollo and Diana. While Aeneas contemplated the scene, the Sibyl accosted him. She seemed to know his errand, and under the influence of the deity of the place, burst forth in a prophetic strain, giving dark intimations of the labors and perils through which he was destined to make his way to final success. She closed with the encouraging words which have become proverbial. Yield not to disasters, but press onward the more bravely. Aeneas replied that he had prepared himself for whatever might await him. He had but one request to make. Having been directed in a dream to seek the abode of the dead in order to confer with his father Anchises, to receive from him a revelation of his future fortunes and those of his race, he asked her assistance to enable him to accomplish the task. The Sibyl replied, "The descent to Avernus is easy. The gate of Pluto stands open night and day, but to retrace one's steps and return to the upper air, that is the toil, that is the difficulty." She instructed him to seek in the forest a tree on which grew a golden branch. This branch was to be plucked off and borne as a gift to Proserpine, and if fate was propitious, it would yield to the hand and quit its parent's trunk, but otherwise no force could rend it away. If torn away, another would succeed. Aeneas followed the directions of the Sibyl. His mother Venus sent 2 of her doves to fly before him and show him the way, and by their assistance he found the tree, plucked the branch, and hastened back with it to the Sibyl. End of chapter 31.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linny. Bulfinch's Mythology, The Age of Fable, by Thomas Bulfinch. Chapter 32. The Infernal Regions. The Sibyl. The Infernal Regions. As, at the commencement of our series, we have given the pagan account of the creation of the world, so, as we approach its conclusion, we present a view of the regions of the dead, depicted by one of their most enlightened poets, who drew his doctrines from their most esteemed philosophers. The region where Virgil locates the entrance to this abode is perhaps the most strikingly adapted to excite ideas of the terrific and preternatural of any on the face of the earth. It is the volcanic region near Vesuvius, where the whole country is cleft with chasms, from which sulphurous flames arise, while the ground is shaken with pent-up vapors, and mysterious sounds issue from the bowels of the earth. The lake Avernus is supposed to fill the crater of an extinct volcano. It is circular, half a mile wide, and very deep, surrounded by high banks, which, in Virgil's time, were covered with a gloomy forest. Mephitic vapors rise from its waters, so that no life is found on its banks, and no birds fly over it. Here, according to the poet, was the cave which afforded access to the infernal regions, and here Aeneas offered sacrifices to the infernal deities, Proserpine, Hecate, and the Furies. Then a roaring was heard in the earth, the woods on the hilltops were shaken, and the howling of dogs announced the approach of the deities. "Now," said the Sibyl, "summon up your courage, for you will need it." She descended into the cave, and Aeneas followed. Before the threshold of hell they passed through a group of beings who are enumerated as griefs and avenging cares, pale diseases, and melancholy age, fear, and hunger that tempt to crime, toil, poverty, and death, forms horrible to view. The Furies spread their couches there, and Discord, whose hair was of vipers, tied up with a bloody fillet. Here also were the monsters, Briareus with his 100 arms, hydras hissing, and chimeras breathing fire. Aeneas shuddered at the sight, drew his sword, and would have struck, but the Sibyl restrained him. They then came to the black river Cocytus, where they found the ferryman, Charon, old and squalid, but strong and vigorous, who was receiving passengers of all kinds into his boat. Magnanimous heroes, boys and unmarried girls, as numerous as the leaves that fall at autumn, or the flocks that fly southward at the approach of winter. They stood, pressing for a passage and longing to touch the opposite shore. But the stern ferryman took in only such as he chose, driving the rest back. Aeneas, wondering at the sight, asked the Sibyl, "Why this discrimination?" She answered, "Those who are taken on board the bark are the souls of those who have received due burial rites. The host of others who have remained unburied are not permitted to pass the flood, but wander 100 years, and flit to and fro about the shore, till at last they are taken over." Aeneas grieved at recollecting some of his own companions who had perished in the storm. At that moment he beheld Palinurus, his pilot, who fell overboard and was drowned. He addressed him and asked him the cause of his misfortune. Palinurus replied that the rudder was carried away, and he, clinging to it, was swept away with it. He besought Aeneas most urgently to extend to him his hand and take him in company to the opposite shore. But the Sibyl rebuked him for the wish thus to transgress the laws of Pluto, but consoled him by informing him that the people of the shore where his body had been wafted by the waves should be stirred up by prodigies to give it due burial, and that the promontory should bear the name of Cape Palinurus, which it does to this day. Leaving Palinurus consoled by these words, they approached the boat. Charon, fixing his eyes sternly upon the advancing warrior, demanded by what right he, living and armed, approached that shore. To which the Sibyl replied that they would commit no violence, that Aeneas's only object was to see his father, and finally exhibited the golden branch, at sight of which Charon's wrath relaxed, and he made haste to turn his bark to the shore and receive them on board. The boat, adapted only to the light freight of bodiless spirits, groaned under the weight of the hero. They were soon conveyed to the opposite shore. There they were encountered by the 3-headed dog, Cerberus, with his neck bristling with snakes. He barked with all his 3 throats, till the Sibyl threw him a medicated cake, which he eagerly devoured, and then stretched himself out in his den and fell asleep. Aeneas and the Sibyl sprang to land. The first sound that struck their ears was the wailing of young children who had died on the threshold of life, and near to these were they who had perished under false charges. Minos presides over them as judge, and examines the deeds of each. The next class was of those who had died by their own hand, hating life and seeking refuge in death. Oh, how willingly would they now endure poverty, labor, and any other infliction, if they might but return to life! Next were situated the regions of sadness, divided off into retired paths, leading through groves of myrtle. Here roamed those who had fallen victims to unrequited love, not freed from pain even by death itself. Among these, Aeneas thought he descried the form of Dido, with a wound still recent. In the dim light he was for a moment uncertain, but approaching, perceived it was indeed herself. Tears fell from his eyes, and he addressed her in the accents of love. Unhappy Dido, was then the rumour true that you had perished? And was I, alas, the cause? I call the gods to witness that my departure from you was reluctant, and in obedience to the commands of Jove. Nor could I believe that my absence would cost you so dear. Stop, I beseech you, and refuse me not a last farewell. She stood for a moment, with averted countenance, and eyes fixed on the ground, and then silently passed on, as insensible to his pleadings as a rock. Aeneas followed for some distance, then, with a heavy heart, rejoined his companion and resumed his route. They next entered the fields where roamed the heroes who have fallen in battle. Here they saw many shades of Grecian and Trojan warriors. The Trojans thronged around him, and could not be satisfied with the sight. They asked the cause of his coming, and plied him with innumerable questions. But the Greeks, at the sight of his armour glittering through the murky atmosphere, recognized the hero, and filled with terror turned their backs and fled, as they used to do on the plains of Troy. Aeneas would have lingered long with his Trojan friends, but the Sibyl hurried him away. They next came to a place where the road divided, the one leading to Elysium, the other to the regions of the condemned. Aeneas beheld, on one side, the walls of a mighty city, around which Phlegethon rolled its fiery waters. Before him was the gate of adamant that neither gods nor men can break through. An iron tower stood by the gate, on which Tisiphone, the avenging Fury, kept guard. From the city were heard groans, and the sound of the scourge, the creaking of iron, and the clanking of chains. Aeneas, horror-struck, inquired of his guide what crimes were those whose punishments produced the sounds he heard. The Sibyl answered, "Here is the judgment hall of Rhadamanthus, who brings to light crimes done in life, which the perpetrator vainly thought impenetrably hid. Tisiphone applies her whip of scorpions, and delivers the offender over to her sister Furies." At this moment, with horrid clang, the brazen gates unfolded, and Aeneas saw within a hydra with 50 heads guarding the entrance. The Sibyl told him that the gulf of Tartarus descended deep, so that its recesses were as far beneath their feet as heaven was high above their heads. In the bottom of this pit the Titan race, who warred against the gods, lie prostrate. Salmoneus also, who presumed to vie with Jupiter, and built a bridge of brass over which he drove his chariot, that the sound might resemble thunder, launching flaming brands at his people, an imitation of lightning, till Jupiter struck him with a real thunderbolt, and taught him the difference between mortal weapons and divine. Here also is Tityus, the giant, whose form is so immense that as he lies he stretches over 9 acres, while a vulture preys upon his liver, which, as fast as it is devoured, grows again, so that his punishment will have no end. Aeneas saw groups seated at tables loaded with dainties, while nearby stood a fury who snatched away the viands from their lips as fast as they prepared to taste them. Others beheld suspended over their heads huge rocks, threatening to fall, keeping them in a state of constant alarm. These were they who had hated their brothers, or struck their parents, or defrauded the friends who trusted them, or who, having grown rich, kept their money to themselves, and gave no share to others, the last being the most numerous class. Here also were those who had violated the marriage vow, or fought in a bad cause, or failed in fidelity to their employers. Here was one who had sold his country for gold, another who perverted the laws, making them say one thing today and another tomorrow. Ixion was there, fastened to the circumference of a wheel ceaselessly revolving, and Sisyphus, whose task was to roll a huge stone up to a hilltop. But when the steep was well nigh gained, the rock, repulsed by some sudden force, rushed again headlong down to the plain. Again he toiled at it, while the sweat bathed all his weary limbs, but all to no effect. There was Tantalus, who stood in a pool, his chin level with the water, yet he was parched with thirst, and found nothing to assuage it. For when he bowed his hoary head, eager to quaff, the water fled away, leaving the ground at his feet all dry. Tall trees, laden with fruit, stooped their heads to him, pears, pomegranates, apples, and luscious figs. But when with a sudden grasp he tried to seize them, winds whirled them high above his reach. The Sibyl now warned Aeneas that it was time to turn from these melancholy regions and seek the city of the blest. They passed through a middle tract of darkness, and came upon the Elysian fields, the groves where the happy reside. They breathed a freer air, and saw all objects clothed in a purple light. The region has a sun and stars of its own. The inhabitants were enjoying themselves in various ways, some in sports on the grassy turf, in games of strength or skill, others dancing or singing. Orpheus struck the chords of his lyre, and called forth ravishing sounds. Here Aeneas saw the founders of the Trojan state, magnanimous heroes who lived in happier times. He gazed with admiration on the war chariots and glittering arms now reposing in disuse. Spears stood fixed in the ground, and the horses, unharnessed, roamed over the plain. The same pride in splendid armour and generous steeds which the old heroes felt in life accompanied them here. He saw another group, feasting and listening to the strains of music. They were in a laurel grove, whence the river Po has its origin, and flows out among men. Here dwelt those who fell by wounds received in their country's cause, holy priests also, and poets who have uttered thoughts worthy of Apollo, and others who have contributed to cheer and adorn life by their discoveries in the useful arts, and have made their memory blessed by rendering service to mankind. They wore snow-white fillets about their brows. The Sibyl addressed a group of these, and enquired where Anchises was to be found. They were directed where to seek him, and soon found him in a verdant valley, where he was contemplating the ranks of his posterity, their destinies and worthy deeds to be achieved in coming times. When he recognized Aeneas approaching, he stretched out both hands to him, while tears flowed freely. "Have you come at last?" said he, "long expected, and do I behold you after such perils past? O my son, how have I trembled for you, as I have watched your career!" To which Aeneas replied, "O father, your image was always before me to guide and guard me." Then he endeavored to enfold his father in his embrace, but his arms enclosed only an unsubstantial image. Aeneas perceived before him a spacious valley, with trees gently waving to the wind, a tranquil landscape through which the river Lethe flowed. Along the banks of the stream wandered a countless multitude, numerous as insects in the summer air. Aeneas, with surprise, inquired who were these. Anchises answered, "They are souls to which bodies are to be given in due time. Meanwhile they dwell on Lethe's bank, and drink oblivion of their former lives." "O father," said Aeneas, "is it possible that any can be so in love with life as to wish to leave these tranquil seats for the upper world?" Anchises replied by explaining the plan of creation. The Creator, he told him, originally made the material of which souls are composed of the 4 elements: fire, air, earth, and water, all which, when united, took the form of the most excellent part, fire, and became flame. This material was scattered like seed among the heavenly bodies, the sun, moon, and stars. Of this seed the inferior gods created man and all other animals, mingling it with various proportions of earth, by which its purity was alloyed and reduced. Thus the more earth predominates in the composition, the less pure is the individual. And we see men and women with their full-grown bodies have not the purity of childhood. So, in proportion to the time which the union of body and soul has lasted, is the impurity contracted by the spiritual part. This impurity must be purged away after death, which is done by ventilating the souls in the current of winds, or merging them in water, or burning out their impurities by fire. Some few, of whom Anchises intimates that he is one, are admitted at once to Elysium, there to remain. But the rest, after the impurities of earth are purged away, are sent back to life, endowed with new bodies, having had the remembrance of their former lives effectually washed away by the waters of Lethe. Some, however, there still are, so thoroughly corrupted that they are not fit to be entrusted with human bodies, and these are made into brutal animals, lions, tigers, cats, dogs, monkeys, etc. This is what the ancients called metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls, a doctrine which is still held by the natives of India, who scruple to destroy the life even of the most insignificant animal, not knowing but it may be one of their relatives in an altered form. Anchises, having explained so much, proceeded to point out to Aeneas individuals of his race, who were hereafter to be born, and to relate to him the exploits they should perform in the world. After this he reverted to the present, and told his son of the events that remained to him to be accomplished before the complete establishment of himself and his followers in Italy. Wars were to be waged, battles fought, a bride to be won, and, in the result, a Trojan state founded, from which should rise the Roman power, to be in time the sovereign of the world. Aeneas and the Sibyl then took leave of Anchises, and returned by some short cut which the poet does not explain, to the upper world. Elysium. Virgil, we have seen, places his Elysium under the earth, and assigns it for a residence to the spirits of the blessed. But in Homer, Elysium forms no part of the realms of the dead. He places it on the west of the earth, near ocean, and describes it as a happy land, where there is neither snow, nor cold, nor rain, and always fanned by the delightful breezes of Zephyrus. Hither favored heroes pass without dying, and live happy under the rule of Rhadamanthus. The Elysium of Hesiod and Pindar is in the Isles of the Blessed, or Fortunate Islands, in the Western Ocean. From these sprang the legend of the happy island Atlantis. This blissful region may have been wholly imaginary, but possibly may have sprung from the reports of some storm-driven mariners who had caught a glimpse of the coast of America. J.R. Lowell, in one of his shorter poems, claims for the present age some of the privileges of that happy realm. Addressing the past, he says, "Whatever of true life there was in thee leaps in our age's veins. Here, mid the bleak waves of our strife and care, float the green Fortunate Isles, where all thy heroes' spirits dwell and share our martyrdoms and toils. The present moves attended with all of brave and excellent and fair that made the old times splendid." Milton also alludes to the same fable in Paradise Lost, Book 3, 1, 568. Like those Hesperian gardens famed of old, fortunate fields and groves and flowery vales, thrice happy isles. And in Book 2, he characterizes the rivers of Erebus according to the meaning of their names in the Greek language. Abhorred Styx, the flood of deadly hate; sad Acheron, of sorrow black and deep; Cocytus, named of lamentation loud heard on the rueful stream; fierce Phlegethon, whose waves of torrent fire inflame with rage. Far off from these a slow and silent stream, Lethe, the river of oblivion, rolls her watery labyrinth, whereof who drinks forthwith his former state and being forgets both joy and grief, pleasure and pain. The Sibyl. As Aeneas and the Sibyl pursue their way back to earth, he said to her, "Whether thou be a goddess or a mortal beloved of the gods, by me thou shalt always be held in reverence. When I reach the upper air, I will cause a temple to be built to thy honor, and will myself bring offerings." "I am no goddess," said the Sibyl. "I have no claim to sacrifice or offering. I am mortal. Yet, if I could have accepted the love of Apollo, I might have been immortal. He promised me the fulfillment of my wish if I would consent to be his. I took a handful of sand, and holding it forth said, 'Grant me to see as many birthdays as there are sand grains in my hand.' Unluckily, I forgot to ask for enduring youth. This also he would have granted could I have accepted his love, but offended at my refusal, he allowed me to grow old. My youth and youthful strength fled long ago. I have lived 700 years, and to equal the number of the sand grains, I have still to see 300 springs and 300 harvests. My body shrinks up as years increase, and in time I shall be lost to sight, but my voice will remain, and future ages will respect my sayings." These concluding words of the Sibyl alluded to her prophetic power. In her cave she was accustomed to inscribe on leaves gathered from the trees the names and fates of individuals. The leaves thus inscribed were arranged in order within the cave, and might be consulted by her votaries. But if perchance at the opening of the door the wind rushed in and dispersed the leaves, the Sibyl gave no aid to restoring them again, and the oracle was irreparably lost. The following legend of the Sibyl is fixed at a later date. In the reign of one of the Tarquins, there appeared before the king a woman who offered him 9 books for sale. The king refused to purchase them, whereupon the woman went away and burned 3 of the books, and returning, offered the remaining books for the same price she had asked for the 9. The king again rejected them, but when the woman, after burning 3 books more, returned and asked for the 3 remaining the same price which she had before asked for the 9, his curiosity was excited, and he purchased the books. They were found to contain the destinies of the Roman state. They were kept in the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, preserved in a stone chest, and allowed to be inspected only by special officers appointed for that duty, who, on great occasions, consulted them and interpreted their oracles to the people. There were various Sibyls, but the Cumaean Sibyl, of whom Ovid and Virgil write, is the most celebrated of them. Ovid's story of her life, protracted to 1,000 years, may be intended to represent the various Sibyls as being only reappearances of one and the same individual. Young, in the Night Thoughts, alludes to the Sibyl. Speaking of worldly wisdom, he says, "If future fate she plans still all in leaves, like Sibyl, unsubstantial, fleeting bliss, at the first blast it vanishes in air. As worldly schemes resemble Sibyl's leaves, the good man's days to Sibyl's books compare, the price still rising as in number less." End of chapter 32. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lenny. Bulfinch's Mythology, The Age of Fable, by Thomas Bulfinch. Chapter 33. Camilla, Evander, Nisus and Aurelius, Mezentius, Turnus. Aeneas, having parted from the Sibyl and rejoined his fleet, coasted along the shores of Italy, and cast anchor in the mouth of the Tiber. The poet, having brought his hero to this spot, the destined termination of his wanderings, invokes his muse to tell him the situation of things at that eventful moment. Latinus, third in descent from Saturn, ruled the country. He was now old and had no male descendant, but had one charming daughter, Lavinia, who was sought in marriage by many neighboring chiefs, one of whom, Turnus, king of the Rutulians, was favored by the wishes of her parents. But Latinus had been warned in a dream by his father Faunus that the destined husband of Lavinia should come from a foreign land. From that union should spring a race destined to subdue the world. Our readers will remember that in the conflict with the Harpies, one of those half-human birds had threatened the Trojans with dire sufferings. In particular, she predicted that, before their wanderings ceased, they should be pressed by hunger to devour their tables. This portent now came true, for, as they took their scanty meal, seated on the grass, the men placed their hard biscuit on their laps, and put thereon whatever their gleanings in the woods supplied. Having dispatched the latter, they finished by eating the crusts, seeing which, the boy Iülus said playfully, "See, we are eating our tables." Aeneas caught the words and accepted the omen. "All hail, promised land!" he exclaimed. "This is our home, this our country." He then took measures to find out who were the present inhabitants of the land, and who their rulers. 100 chosen men were sent to the village of Latinus, bearing presents and a request for friendship and alliance. They went, and were favourably received. Latinus immediately concluded that the Trojan hero was no other than the promised son-in-law announced by the oracle. He cheerfully granted his alliance, and sent back the messengers mounted on steeds from his stables, and loaded with gifts and friendly messages. Juno, seeing things go thus prosperously for the Trojans, felt her old animosity revive, summoned Alecto from Erebus, and sent her to stir up discord. The fury first took possession of the queen, Amata, and roused her to oppose in every way the new alliance. Alecto then speeded to the city of Turnus, and assuming the form of an old priestess, informed him of the arrival of the foreigners, and of the attempts of their prince to rob him of his bride. Next she turned her attention to the camp of the Trojans. There she saw the boy Iülus and his companions amusing themselves with hunting. She sharpened the scent of the dogs, and led them to rouse up from the thicket a tame stag, the favourite of Silvia, the daughter of Tyreus, the king's herdsman. A javelin from the hand of Iülus wounded the animal, and he had only strength left to run homewards, and died at his mistress's feet. Her cries and tears roused her brothers and the herdsmen, and they, seizing whatever weapons came to hand, furiously assaulted the hunting party. These were protected by their friends, and the herdsmen were finally driven back with the loss of 2 of their number. These things were enough to rouse the storm of war, and the queen, Turnus, and the peasants all urged the old king to drive the strangers from the country. He resisted as long as he could, but finding his opposition unavailing, finally gave way and retreated to his retirement. Opening the gates of Janus. It was the custom of the country, when war was to be undertaken, for the chief magistrate, clad in his robes of office, with solemn pomp, to open the gates of the temple of Janus, which were kept shut as long as peace endured. His people now urged the old king to perform that solemn office, but he refused to do so. While they contested, Juno herself, descending from the skies, smote the doors with irresistible force and burst them open. Immediately the whole country was in a flame. The people rushed from every side, breathing nothing but war. Turnus was recognized by all as leader. Others joined as allies, chief of whom was Mezentius, a brave and able soldier, but of detestable cruelty. He had been the chief of one of the neighbouring cities, but his people drove him out. With him was joined his son Lausus, a generous youth, worthy of a better sire. Camilla. Camilla, the favourite of Diana, a huntress and warrior after the fashion of the Amazons, came with her band of mounted followers, including a select number of her own sex, and ranged herself on the side of Turnus. This maiden had never accustomed her fingers to the distaff or the loom, but had learned to endure the toils of war, and in speed to outstrip the wind. It seemed as if she might run over the standing corn without crushing it, or over the surface of the water without dipping her feet. Camilla's history had been singular from the beginning. Her father, Metabus, driven from his city by civil discord, carried with him in his flight his infant daughter. As he fled through the woods, his enemies in hot pursuit, he reached the bank of the river Amazinus, which, swelled by rains, seemed to debar a passage. He paused for a moment, then decided what to do. He tied the infant to his lance with wrappers of bark, and poising the weapon in his upraised hand, thus addressed Diana: "Goddess of the woods, I consecrate this maid to you." Then hurled the weapon with its burden to the opposite bank. The spear flew across the roaring water. His pursuers were already upon him, but he plunged into the river and swam across, and found the spear with the infant safe on the other side. Henceforth he lived among the shepherds, and brought up his daughter in woodland arts. While a child, she was taught to use the bow and throw the javelin. With her sling she could bring down the crane or the wild swan. Her dress was a tiger's skin. Many mothers sought her for a daughter-in-law, but she continued faithful to Diana, and repelled the thought of marriage. Evander. Such were the formidable allies that ranged themselves against Aeneas. It was night, and he lay stretched in sleep on the bank of the river under the open heavens. The god of the stream, Father Tiber, seemed to raise his head above the willows, and to say, "O goddess-born, destined possessor of the Latin realms, this is the promised land, here is to be your home. Here shall terminate the hostility of the heavenly powers, if only you faithfully persevere. There are friends not far distant. Prepare your boats and row up my stream. I will lead you to Evander, the Arcadian chief. He has long been at strife with Turnus and the Rutulians, and is prepared to become an ally of yours. Rise, offer your vows to Juno, and deprecate her anger. When you have achieved your victory, then think of me." Aeneas woke, and paid immediate obedience to the friendly vision. He sacrificed to Juno, and invoked the god of the river and all his tributary fountains to lend their aid. Then, for the first time, a vessel filled with armed warriors floated on the stream of the Tiber. The river smoothed its waves and bade its current flow gently, while, impelled by the vigorous strokes of the rowers, the vessel shot rapidly up the stream. About the middle of the day they came in sight of the scattered buildings of the infant town, where, in after times, the proud city of Rome grew, whose glory reached the skies. By chance the old king, Evander, was that day celebrating annual solemnities in honor of Hercules and all the gods. Pallas, his son, and all the chiefs of the little commonwealth stood by. When they saw the tall ship gliding onward near the wood, they were alarmed at the sight and rose from the tables. But Pallas forbade the solemnities to be interrupted, and seizing a weapon, stepped forward to the river's bank. He called aloud, demanding who they were and what their object. Aeneas, holding forth an olive branch, replied, "We are Trojans, friends to you, and enemies to the Rutulians. We seek Evander, and offer to join our arms with yours." Pallas, in amaze at the sound of so great a name, invited them to land, and when Aeneas touched the shore he seized his hand and held it long in friendly grasp. Proceeding through the wood, they joined the king and his party, and were most favourably received. Seats were provided for them at the tables, and the repast proceeded. Infant Rome. When the solemnities were ended, all moved towards the city. The king, bending with age, walked between his son and Aeneas, taking the arm of one or the other of them, and with much variety of pleasing talk shortening the way. Aeneas, with delight, looked and listened, observing all the beauties of the scene, and learning much of heroes renowned in ancient times. Evander said, "These extensive groves were once inhabited by fauns and nymphs, and a rude race of men who sprang from the trees themselves, and had neither laws nor social culture. They knew not how to yoke the cattle, nor raise a harvest, nor provide from present abundance for future want, but browsed like beasts upon the leafy boughs, or fed voraciously on their hunted prey. Such were they, when Saturn, expelled from Olympus by his sons, came among them, and drew together the fierce savages, formed them into society, and gave them laws. Such peace and plenty ensued that men ever since have called his reign the Golden Age, but by degrees far other times succeeded, and the thirst of gold and the thirst of blood prevailed. The land was a prey to successive tyrants, till fortune and resistless destiny brought me hither, an exile from my native land, Arcadia." Having thus said, he showed him the Tarpeian rock, and the rude spot then overgrown with bushes, where, in after times, the Capitol rose in all its magnificence. He next pointed to some dismantled walls, and said, "Here stood Janiculum, built by Janus, and there Saturnia, the town of Saturn." Such discourse brought them to the cottage of poor Evander, whence they saw the lowing herds roaming over the plain where now the proud and stately Forum stands. They entered, and a couch was spread for Aeneas, well stuffed with leaves and covered with the skin of a Libyan bear. Next morning, awakened by the dawn and the shrill song of birds beneath the eaves of his low mansion, old Evander rose. Clad in a tunic, and a panther's skin thrown over his shoulders, with sandals on his feet and his good sword girded to his side, he went forth to seek his guest. 2 mastiffs followed him, his whole retinue and bodyguard. He found the hero attended by his faithful Achates, and, Pallas soon joining them, the old king spoke thus: "Illustrious Troyan, it is but little we can do in so great a cause. Our state is feeble, hemmed in on one side by the river, on the other by the Rutulians. But I propose to ally you with a people numerous and rich, to whom fate has brought you at the propitious moment. The Etruscans hold the country beyond the river. Mezentius was their king, a monster of cruelty, who invented unheard-of torments to gratify his vengeance. He would fasten the dead to the living, hand to hand and face to face, and leave the wretched victims to die in that dreadful embrace. At length the people cast him out, him and his house. They burned his palace and slew his friends. He escaped and took refuge with Turnus, who protects him with arms. The Etruscans demand that he shall be given up to deserved punishment, and would ere now have attempted to enforce their demand. But their priests restrain them, telling them that it is the will of heaven that no native of the land shall guide them to victory, and that their destined leader must come from across the sea. They have offered the crown to me, but I am too old to undertake such great affairs, and my son is native born, which precludes him from the choice. You equally, by birth and time of life, and fame in arms, pointed out by the gods, have but to appear to be hailed at once as their leader. With you I will join Pallas, my son, my only hope and comfort. Under you he shall learn the art of war, and strive to emulate your great exploits." Then the king ordered horses to be furnished for the Trojan chiefs, and Aeneas, with a chosen band of followers, and Pallas accompanying, mounted, and took the way to the Etruscan city, having sent back the rest of his party in the ships. Aeneas and his band safely arrived at the Etruscan camp, and were received with open arms by Tarchon and his countrymen. Nisus and Euryalus. In the meanwhile, Turnus had collected his bands, and made all necessary preparation for the war. Juno sent Iris to him with a message, inciting him to take advantage of the absence of Aeneas, and surprise the Trojan camp. Accordingly, the attempt was made, but the Trojans were found on their guard, and having received strict orders from Aeneas not to fight in his absence, they lay still in their entrenchments, and resisted all the efforts of the Rutulians to draw them into the field. Night coming on, the army of Turnus, in high spirits at their fancied superiority, feasted and enjoyed themselves, and finally stretched themselves on the field and slept secure. In the camp of the Trojans things were far otherwise. There all was watchfulness and anxiety and impatience for Aeneas's return. Nisus stood guard at the entrance of the camp, and Euryalus, a youth distinguished above all in the army for graces of person and fine qualities, was with him. These two were friends and brothers in arms. Nisus said to his friend, "Do you perceive what confidence and carelessness the enemy display? Their lights are few and dim, and the men seem all oppressed with wine or sleep. You know how anxiously our chiefs wish to send to Aeneas, and to get intelligence from him. Now I am strongly moved to make my way through the enemy's camp, and to go in search of our chief. If I succeed, the glory of the deed will be reward enough for me, and if they judge the service deserves anything more, let them pay it to you." Euryalus, all on fire with the love of adventure, replied, "Would you then, Nisus, refuse to share your enterprise with me? And shall I let you go into such danger alone? Not so my brave father brought me up, nor so have I planned for myself when I joined the standard of Aeneas, and resolved to hold my life cheap in comparison with honor." Nisus replied, "I doubt it not, my friend, but you know the uncertain event of such an undertaking, and whatever may happen to me, I wish you to be safe. You are younger than I, and have more of life in prospect. Nor can I be the cause of such grief to your mother, who has chosen to be here in the camp with you rather than stay and live in peace with the other matrons in Acestus' city." Euryalus replied, "Say no more. In vain you seek arguments to dissuade me. I am fixed in the resolution to go with you. Let us lose no time." They called the guard, and committing the watch to them, sought the general's tent. They found the chief officers in consultation, deliberating how they should send notice to Aeneas of their situation. The offer of the two friends was gladly accepted, themselves loaded with praises, and promised the most liberal rewards in case of success. Iulus especially addressed Euryalus, assuring him of his lasting friendship. Euryalus replied, "I have but one boon to ask. My aged mother is with me in the camp. For me she left the Trojan soil, and would not stay behind with the other matrons at the city of Acestus. I go now without taking leave of her. I could not bear her tears, nor sat at now her entreaties. But do thou, I beseech you, comfort her in her distress. Promise me that I shall go more boldly into whatever dangers may present themselves." Iülus and the other chiefs were moved to tears, and promised to do all his request. "Your mother shall be mine," said Iülus, "and all that I have promised to you shall be made good to her, if you do not return to receive it." The two friends left the camp, and plunged at once into the midst of the enemy. They found no watch, no sentinels posted, but, all about, the sleeping soldiers strewn on the grass and among the wagons. The laws of war at that early day did not forbid a brave man to slay a sleeping foe, and the two Trojans slew, as they passed, such of the enemy as they could without exciting alarm. In one tent Euryalus made prize of a helmet brilliant with golden plumes. They had passed through the enemy's ranks without being discovered, but now suddenly appeared a troop directly in front of them, which, under Volscens, their leader, were approaching the camp. The glittering helmet of Euryalus caught their attention, and Volscens hailed the two, and demanded who and whence they were. They made no answer, but plunged into the wood. The horsemen scattered in all directions to intercept their flight. Nisus had eluded pursuit and was out of danger, but Euryalus being missing, he turned back to seek him. He again entered the wood, and soon came within sound of voices. Looking through the thicket, he saw the whole band surrounding Euryalus, with noisy questions. What should he do? How extricate the youth, or would it be better to die with him? Raising his eyes to the moon, which now shone clear, he said, "Goddess, favor my effort," and aiming his javelin at one of the leaders of the troop, struck him in the back and stretched him on the plain with a death blow. In the midst of their amazement another weapon flew, and another of the party fell dead. Volscens, the leader, ignorant whence the darts came, rushed sword in hand upon Euryalus. "You shall pay the penalty of both," he said, and would have plunged the sword into his bosom, when Nisus, who from his concealment saw the peril of his friend, rushed forward exclaiming, "'Twas I! 'Twas I! Turn your swords against me, Rutulians. I did it. He only followed me as a friend." While he spoke, the sword fell and pierced the comely bosom of Euryalus. His head fell over on his shoulder like a flower cut down by the plough. Nisus rushed upon Volscens and plunged his sword into his body, and was himself slain on the instant by numberless blows. Mezentius. Aeneas, with his Etrurian lies, arrived on the scene of action, in time to rescue his beleaguered camp. And now, the two armies being nearly equal in strength, the war began in good earnest. We cannot find space for all the details, but must simply record the fate of the principal characters whom we have introduced to our readers. The tyrant Mezentius, finding himself engaged against his revolting subjects, raged like a wild beast. He slew all who dared to withstand him, and put the multitude to flight wherever he appeared. At last he encountered Aeneas, and the armies stood still to see the issue. Mezentius threw his spear, which, striking Aeneas's shield, glanced off and hit Anther. He was a Grecian by birth, who had left Argos, his native city, and followed Evander into Italy. The poet says of him, with simple pathos, which has made the words proverbial, "He fell, unhappy, by a wound intended for another, looked up at the skies, and dying remembered sweet Argos." Aeneas now in turn hurled his lance. It pierced the shield of Mezentius and wounded him in the thigh. Lausus, his son, could not bear the sight, but rushed forward and interposed himself, while the followers pressed round Mezentius and bore him away. Aeneas held his sword suspended over Lausus, and delayed to strike, but the furious youth pressed on, and he was compelled to deal the fatal blow. Lausus fell, and Aeneas bent over him in pity. "Hapless youth," he said, "what can I do for you worthy of your praise? Keep those arms in which you glory, and fear not but that your body shall be restored to your friends and have due funeral honours." So saying, he called the timid followers and delivered the body into their hands. Mezentius, meanwhile, had been borne to the riverside and washed his wound. Soon the news reached him of Lausus's death, and rage and despair supplied the place of strength. He mounted his horse and dashed into the thickest of the fight, seeking Aeneas. Having found him, he rode round him in a circle, throwing one javelin after another, while Aeneas stood fenced with his shield, turning every way to meet them. At last, after Mezentius had 3 times made the circuit, Aeneas threw his lance directly at the horse's head. It pierced his temples, and he fell, while a shout from both armies rent the skies. Mezentius asked no mercy, but only that his body might be spared the insults of his revolted subjects, and be buried in the same grave with his son. He received the fatal stroke, not unprepared, and poured out his life and his blood together. Pallas, Camilla, Turnus. While these things were doing in one part of the field, in another Turnus encountered the youthful Pallas. The contest between champions so unequally matched could not be doubtful. Pallas bore himself bravely, but fell by the lance of Turnus. The victor almost relented when he saw the brave youth lying dead at his feet, and spared to use the privilege of a conqueror in despoiling him of his arms. The belt only, adorned with studs and carvings of gold, he took and clasped round his own body. The rest he remitted to the friends of the slain. After the battle there was a cessation of arms for some days, to allow both armies to bury their dead. In this interval Aeneas challenged Turnus to decide the contest by single combat, but Turnus evaded the challenge. Another battle ensued, in which Camilla, the virgin warrior, was chiefly conspicuous. Her deeds of valor surpassed those of the bravest warriors, and many Trojans and Etruscans fell pierced with her darts or struck down by her battle-axe. At last an Etruscan named Arens, who had watched her long, seeking for some advantage, observed her pursuing a flying enemy whose splendid armor offered a tempting prize. Intent on the chase, she observed not her danger, and the javelin of Arens struck her and inflicted a fatal wound. She fell and breathed her last in the arms of her attendant maidens. But Diana, who beheld her fate, suffered not her slaughter to be unavenged. Arens, as he stole away, glad but frightened, was struck by a secret arrow launched by one of the nymphs of Diana's train, and died ignobly and unknown. At length the final conflict took place between Aeneas and Turnus. Turnus had avoided the contest as long as he could, but at last, impelled by the ill success of his arms and by the murmurs of his followers, he braced himself to the conflict. It could not be doubtful. On the side of Aeneas were the express decree of destiny, the aid of his goddess mother at every emergency, and impenetrable armor fabricated by Vulcan at her request for her son. Turnus, on the other hand, was deserted by his celestial allies, Juno having been expressly forbidden by Jupiter to assist him any longer. Turnus threw his lance, but it recoiled, harmless, from the shield of Aeneas. The Trojan hero then threw his, which penetrated the shield of Turnus, and pierced his thigh. Then Turnus's fortitude forsook him, and he begged for mercy. and Aeneas would have given him his life, but at the instant his eye fell on the belt of Pallas, which Turnus had taken from the slaughtered youth. Instantly his rage revived, and exclaiming, "Pallas immolates thee with this blow," he thrust him through with his sword. Here the poem of the Aeneid closes, and we are left to infer that Aeneas, having triumphed over his foes, obtained Lavinia for his bride. Tradition adds that he founded his city and called it after her name, Lavinium. His son Iulus founded Alba Longa, which was the birthplace of Romulus and Remus and the cradle of Rome itself. There is an allusion to Camilla in those well-known lines of Pope, in which, illustrating the rule that the sound should be an echo to the sense, he says, "When Ajax strives some rock's vast weight to throw, the line too labors and the words move slow. Not so when swift Camilla scours the plain, flies over the unbending corn or skims along the main." Essay in Criticism. End of chapter 33.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine. Bulfinch Mythology, The Age of Fable by Thomas Bulfinch. Chapter 34. Pythagoras, Egyptian Deities, Oracles. Pythagoras. The teachings of Anchises to Aeneas respecting the nature of the human soul were in conformity with the doctrines of the Pythagoreans. Pythagoras, born 540 years B.C., was a native of the island of Samos, but passed the chief portion of his life at Crotona in Italy. He is therefore sometimes called the Samian, and sometimes the philosopher of Crotona. When young he travelled extensively, and it is said visited Egypt, where he was instructed by the priests in all their learning, and afterwards journeyed to the east, and visited the Persian and Chaldean Magi and the Brahmins of India. At Crotona, where he finally established himself, his extraordinary qualities collected round him a great number of disciples. The inhabitants were notorious for luxury and licentiousness, but the good effects of his influence were soon visible. Sobriety and temperance succeeded. 600 of the inhabitants became his disciples, and enrolled themselves in a society to aid each other in the pursuit of wisdom, uniting their property in one common stock for the benefit of the whole. They were required to practice the greatest purity and simplicity of manners. The first lesson they learned was silence. For a time they were required to be only hearers. He, Pythagoras, said so, ipse dixit, was to be held by them as sufficient, without any proof. It was only the advanced pupils, after years of patient submission, who were allowed to ask questions and to state objections. Pythagoras considered numbers as the essence and principle of all things, and attributed to them a real and distinct existence, so that, in his view, they were the elements out of which the universe was constructed. How he conceived this process has never been satisfactorily explained. He traced the various forms and phenomena of the world to numbers as their basis and essence. The monad or unit he regarded as the source of all numbers. The number 2 was imperfect, and the cause of increase and division. 3 was called the number of the whole, because it had a beginning, middle, and end. 4, representing the square, is in the highest degree perfect, and 10, as it contains the sum of the 4 prime numbers, comprehends all musical and arithmetical proportions, and denotes the system of the world. As the numbers proceed from the monad, so he regarded the pure and simple essence of the Deity as the source of all the forms of nature. Gods, demons, and heroes are emanations of the Supreme, and there is a fourth emanation, the human soul. This is immortal, and when freed from the fetters of the body passes to the habitation of the dead, where it remains till it returns to the world, to dwell in some other human or animal body, and at last, when sufficiently purified, it returns to the source from which it proceeded. This doctrine of the transmigration of souls, metempsychosis, which was originally Egyptian and connected with the doctrine of reward and punishment of human actions, was the chief cause why the Pythagoreans killed no animals. Ovid represents Pythagoras addressing his disciples in these words: "Souls never die, but always on quitting one abode pass to another. I myself can remember that in the time of the Trojan war I was Euphorbus, the son of Panthus, and fell by the spear of Menelaus. Lately being in the temple of Juno at Argos, I recognized my shield hung up there among the trophies. All things change, nothing perishes. The soul passes hither and thither, occupying now this body, now that, passing from the body of a beast into that of a man, and thence to a beast's again. As wax is stamped with certain figures, then melted, then stamped anew with others, yet is always the same wax, so the soul, being always the same, yet wears at different times different forms. Therefore, if the love of kindred is not extinct in your bosoms, forbear, I entreat you, to violate the life of those who may haply be your own relatives." Shakespeare, in The Merchant of Venice, makes Gratiano allude to the metempsychosis, where he says to Shylock: "Thou almost mak'st me waver in my faith, to hold opinion with Pythagoras, that souls of animals infuse themselves into the trunks of men, the cursed spirit, governed a wolf, who hanged for human slaughter, infused his soul in thee, for thy desires are wolfish, bloody, starved, and ravenous." The relation of the notes of the musical scale to numbers, whereby harmony results from vibrations in equal times, and discord from the reverse, led Pythagoras to apply the word harmony to the visible creation, meaning by it the just adaptation of parts to each other. This is the idea which Dryden expresses in the beginning of his Song for Saint Cecilia's Day: "From harmony, from heavenly harmony, this everlasting frame began; from harmony to harmony, through all the compass of the notes it ran, the diapason closing full in man." In the center of the universe, he taught, there was a central fire, the principle of life. The central fire was surrounded by the earth, the moon, the sun, and the 5 planets. The distances of the various heavenly bodies from one another were conceived to correspond to the proportions of the musical scale. The heavenly bodies, with the gods who inhabited them, were supposed to perform a choral dance round the central fire, not without song. It is this doctrine which Shakespeare alludes to when he makes Lorenzo teach astronomy to Jessica in this fashion: "Look, Jessica, see how the floor of heaven Is thick inlaid with patines of bright gold. There's not the smallest orb that thou behold'st, But in his motion like an angel sings, Still quiring to the young-eyed cherubim. Such harmony is in immortal souls. But whilst this muddy vesture of decay Does crossly close it in, we cannot hear it." Merchant of Venice. The spheres were conceived to be crystalline or glassy fabrics arranged over one another like a nest of bowls reversed. In the substance of each sphere one or more of the heavenly bodies was supposed to be fixed, so as to move with it. As the spheres are transparent, we look through them and see the heavenly bodies which they contain and carry round with them. But as these spheres cannot move on one another without friction, a sound is thereby produced, which is of exquisite harmony, too fine for mortal ears to recognize. Milton, in his Hymn of the Nativity, thus alludes to the music of the spheres: "Ring out, ye crystal spheres! Once bless our human ears, if ye have power to charm our senses so; and let your silver chime move in melodious time, and let the bass of heaven's deep organ blow, and with your ninefold harmony make up full concert with the angelic symphony." Pythagoras is said to have invented the lyre. Our own poet Longfellow, in verses to a child, thus relates the story: "As great Pythagoras of yore, Standing beside the blacksmith's door, And hearing the hammers as they smote The anvils with a different note, Stole from the varying tones that hung Vibrant on every iron tongue The secret of the sounding wire, And formed the seven chorded lyre." See also the same poet's "Occupation of Orion," "The Samian's great Aeolian lyre." Sybaris and Crotona. Sybaris, a neighboring city to Crotona, was as celebrated for luxury and effeminacy as Crotona for the reverse. The name has become proverbial. H. Re Lowell uses it in this sense in his charming little poem "To the Dandelion": "Not in mid June the golden cuirassed bee Feels a more summer like warm ravishment In the white lily's breezy tent, His conquered Sybaris, than I when first From the dark green thy yellowed surplice burst." A war arose between the two cities, and Sybaris was conquered and destroyed. Milo, the celebrated athlete, led the army of Crotona. Many stories are told of Milo's vast strength, such as his carrying a heifer of 4 years old upon his shoulders and afterwards eating the whole of it in a single day. The mode of his death is thus related: As he was passing through a forest he saw the trunk of a tree which had been partially split open by woodcutters, and attempted to rend it further. But the wood closed upon his hands and held him fast, in which state he was attacked and devoured by wolves. Byron, in his ode to Napoleon Bonaparte, alludes to the story of Milo: "He who of old would rend the oak Deemed not of the rebound; Chained by the trunk he vainly broke, Alone, how looked he round!" Egyptian Deities. The Egyptians acknowledged as the highest deity Amun, afterwards called Zeus, or Jupiter Ammon. Amun manifested himself in his word or will, which created Kneph and Ator of different sexes. From Kneph and Ator proceeded Osiris and Isis. Osiris was worshipped as the god of the sun, the source of warmth, life, and fruitfulness, in addition to which he was also regarded as the god of the Nile, who annually visited his wife, Isis, the earth, by means of an inundation. Serapis or Hermes is sometimes represented as identical with Osiris, and sometimes as a distinct divinity, the ruler of Tartars and god of medicine. Anubis is the guardian god, represented with the dog's head, emblematic of his character of fidelity and watchfulness. Horus or Harpocrates was the son of Osiris. He is represented seated on a lotus flower, with his finger on his lips, as the god of silence. In one of Moore's Irish melodies is an allusion to Harpocrates: "Thy shelf shall, under some rosy bower, Sit mute with thy finger on thy lip, Like him the boy who born among The flowers that on the Nile stream blush, Sits ever thus, his only song To earth and heaven, hush all, hush." Myth of Osiris and Isis. Osiris and Isis were at one time induced to descend to the earth to bestow gifts and blessings on its inhabitants. Isis showed them first the use of wheat and barley, and Osiris made the instruments of agriculture and taught men the use of them, as well as how to harness the ox to the plough. He then gave men laws, the institution of marriage, a civil organization, and taught them how to worship the gods. After he had thus made the valley of the Nile a happy country, he assembled a host, with which he went to bestow his blessings upon the rest of the world. He conquered the nations everywhere, but not with weapons, only with music and eloquence. His brother Typhon saw this, and filled with envy and malice, sought during his absence to usurp his throne. But Isis, who held the reins of government, frustrated his plans. Still more embittered, he now resolved to kill his brother. This he did in the following manner. Having organized a conspiracy of 72 members, he went with them to the feast which was celebrated in honor of the king's return. He then caused a box or chest to be brought in, which had been made to fit exactly the size of Osiris, and declared that he would give that chest of precious wood to whosoever could get into it. The rest tried in vain, but no sooner was Osiris in it than Typhon and his companions closed the lid and flung the chest into the Nile. When Isis heard of the cruel murder she wept and mourned, and then with her hair shorn, clothed in black and beating her breast, she sought diligently for the body of her husband. In this search she was materially assisted by Anubis, the son of Osiris and Nephthys. They sought in vain for some time, for when the chest, carried by the waves to the shores of Byblos, had become entangled in the reeds that grew at the edge of the water, the divine power that dwelt in the body of Osiris imparted such strength to the shrub that it grew into a mighty tree, enclosing in its trunk the coffin of the god. This tree with its sacred deposit was shortly after felled and erected as a column in the palace of the king of Phoenicia. But at length, by the aid of Anubis and the sacred birds, Isis ascertained these facts, and then went to the royal city. There she offered herself at the palace as a servant, and being admitted, threw off her disguise and appeared as a goddess, surrounded with thunder and lightning. Striking the column with her wand, she caused it to split open and give up the sacred coffin. This she seized and returned with it, and concealed it in the depths of a forest. But Typhon discovered it, and cutting the body into 14 pieces, scattered them hither and thither. After tedious search, Isis found 13 pieces, the fishes of the Nile having eaten the other. This she replaced by an imitation of sycamore wood, and buried the body at Philae, which became ever after the great burying place of the nation, and the spot to which pilgrimages were made from all parts of the country. A temple of surpassing magnificence was also erected there in honor of the god, and at every place where one of his limbs had been found, minor temples and tombs were built to commemorate the event. Osiris became after that the tutelar deity of the Egyptians. His soul was supposed always to inhabit the body of the bull Apis, and his death to transfer itself to his successor. Apis, the bull of Memphis, was worshipped with the greatest reverence by the Egyptians. The individual animal who was held to be Apis was recognized by certain signs. It was requisite that he should be quite black, have a white square mark on the forehead, another in the form of an eagle on his back, and under his tongue a lump somewhat in the shape of a scarabaeus or beetle. As soon as a bull thus marked was found by those sent in search of him, he was placed in a building facing the east, and was fed with milk for 4 months. At the expiration of this term, the priests repaired at new moon, with great pomp, to his habitation and saluted him Apis. He was placed in a vessel magnificently decorated and conveyed down the Nile to Memphis, where a temple, with 2 chapels and a court for exercise, was assigned to him. Sacrifices were made to him, and once every year about the time when the Nile began to rise, a golden cup was thrown into the river, and a grand festival was held to celebrate his birthday. The people believed that during this festival the crocodiles forgot their natural ferocity and became harmless. There was, however, one drawback to this happy lot. He was not permitted to live beyond a certain period, and if, when he had attained the age of 25 years, he still survived, the priests drowned him in the sacred cistern, and then buried him in the temple of Serapis. On the death of this bull, whether it occurred in the course of nature or by violence, the whole land was filled with sorrow and lamentations, which lasted until his successor was found. We find the following item in one of the newspapers of the day: "The tomb of Apis. The excavations going on at Memphis bid fair to make that buried city as interesting as Pompeii. The monster tomb of Apis is now open, after having lain unknown for centuries." Milton, in his hymn on the Nativity, alludes to the Egyptian deities not as imaginary beings, but as real demons, put to flight by the coming of Christ. "The brutish god of Nile as fast Isis and Horus and the dog Anubis haste, nor is Osiris seen in Memphian grove or green, trampling the unshowered grass with lowings loud, nor can he be at rest within his sacred chest, naught but profoundest hell can be his shroud. In vain with timbreled anthems dark the sable-stoled sorcerers bear his worshipped ark." [Footnote: There being no rain in Egypt, the grass is unshowered, and the country depend for its fertility upon the overflowings of the Nile. The ark alluded to in the last line is shown by pictures still remaining on the walls of the Egyptian temples to have been borne by the priests in their religious processions. It probably represented the chest in which Osiris was placed. End of footnote. Isis was represented in statuary with the head veiled, a symbol of mystery. It is this which Tennyson alludes to in Maud 4:8: "For the drift of the Maker is dark, and Isis hid by the veil," etc. Oracles. Oracle was the name used to denote the place where answers were supposed to be given by any of the divinities to those who consulted them respecting the future. The word was also used to signify the response which was given. The most ancient Grecian oracle was that of Jupiter at Dodona. According to one account, it was established in the following manner: Two black doves took their flight from Thebes in Egypt. One flew to Dodona in Epirus, and alighting in a grove of oaks, it proclaimed in human language to the inhabitants of the district that they must establish there an oracle of Jupiter. The other dove flew to the temple of Jupiter Ammon in the Libyan oasis, and delivered a similar command there. Another account is that they were not doves, but priestesses, who were carried off from Thebes in Egypt by the Phoenicians, and set up oracles at the oasis and Dodona. The responses of the oracle were given from the trees, by the branches rustling in the wind, the sounds being interpreted by the priests. But the most celebrated of the Grecian oracles was that of Apollo at Delphi, a city built on the slopes of Parnassus in Phocis. It had been observed at a very early period that the goats feeding on Parnassus were thrown into convulsions when they approached a certain long deep cleft in the side of the mountain. This was owing to a peculiar vapor arising out of the cavern, and one of the goatherds was induced to try its effects upon himself. Inhaling the intoxicated air, he was affected in the same manner as the cattle had been, and the inhabitants of the surrounding country. Unable to explain the circumstance, imputed the convulsive ravings to which he gave utterance while under the power of the exhalations to a divine inspiration. The fact was speedily circulated widely, and a temple was erected on the spot. The prophetic influence was at first variously attributed to the goddess Earth, to Neptune, Themis, and others, but it was at length assigned to Apollo, and to him alone. A priestess was appointed whose office it was to inhale the hallowed air, and who was named the Pythia. She was prepared for this duty by previous ablution at the fountain of Castalia, and being crowned with laurel, was seated upon a tripod similarly adorned, which was placed over the chasm whence the divine afflatus proceeded. Her inspired words while thus situated were interpreted by the priests. Oracle of Trophonius. Besides the oracles of Jupiter and Apollo at Dodona and Delphi, that of Trophonius in Boeotia was held in high estimation. Trophonius and Agamedes were brothers. They were distinguished architects who built the temple of Apollo at Delphi and a treasury for King Hyrieus. In the wall of the treasury they placed a stone, in such a manner that it could be taken out, and by this means, from time to time, purloined the treasure. This amazed Hyrieus, for his locks and seals were untouched, and yet his wealth continually diminished. At length he set a trap for the thief, and Agamedes was caught. Trophonius, unable to extricate him, and fearing that when found he would be compelled by torture to discover his accomplice, cut off his head. Trophonius himself is said to have been shortly afterwards swallowed up by the earth. The oracle of Trophonius was at Lebadae in Boeotia. During a great drought the Boeotians, it is said, were directed by the god at Delphi to seek aid of Trophonius at Lebadae. They came thither, but could find no oracle. One of them, however, happening to see a swarm of bees, followed them to a chasm in the earth, which proved to be the place sought. Peculiar ceremonies were to be performed by the person who came to consult the oracle. After these preliminaries he descended into the cave by a narrow passage. This place could be entered only in the night. The person returned from the cave by the same narrow passage, but walking backwards. He appeared melancholy and defected, and hence the proverb which was applied to a person low-spirited and gloomy: "He has been consulting the oracle of Trophonius." Oracle of Aesculapius. There were numerous oracles of Aesculapius, but the most celebrated one was at Epidaurus. Here the sick sought responses and the recovery of their health by sleeping in the temple. It has been inferred from the accounts that have come down to us that the treatment of the sick resembled what is now called animal magnetism or mesmerism. Serpents were sacred to Aesculapius, probably because of a superstition that those animals have a faculty of renewing their youth by a change of skin. The worship of Aesculapius was introduced into Rome in a time of great sickness, and an embassy sent to the temple of Epidaurus to entreat the aid of the god. Aesculapius was propitious, and on the return of the ship accompanied it in the form of a serpent. Arriving in the river Tiber, the serpent glided from the vessel and took possession of an island in the river, and a temple was there erected to his honor. Oracle of Apis. At Memphis the sacred bull Apis gave answer to those who consulted him by the manner in which he received or rejected what was presented to him. If the bull refused food from the hand of the inquirer, it was considered an unfavorable sign, and the contrary when he received it. It has been a question whether oracular responses ought to be ascribed to mere human contrivance or to the agency of evil spirits. The latter opinion has been most general in past ages. A third theory has been advanced since the phenomena of mesmerism have attracted attention, that something like the mesmeric trance was induced in the Pythoness, and the faculty of clairvoyance really called into action. Another question is as to the time when the pagan oracles ceased to give responses. Ancient Christian writers assert that they became silent at the birth of Christ, and were heard no more after that date. Milton adapts this view in his Hymn of the Nativity, and in lines of solemn and elevated beauty pictures the consternation of the heathen idols at the advent of the Saviour. The oracles are dumb. No voice or hideous hum rings through the arched roof in words deceiving. Apollo from his shrine can no more divine, with hollow shriek the steep of Delphos heaving. No nightly trance or breathed spell inspires the pale-eyed priest from the prophetic cell. In Cowper's poem of Yardley Oak there are some beautiful mythological allusions. The former of the two following is to the fable of Castor and Pollux. The latter is more appropriate to our present subject. Addressing the acorn, he says: "Thou fell'st mature, and in the loamy clod, Swelling with vegetative force instinct, Didst burst thine, as there the fabled twins. Now stars! 'Twere lobes protruding, paired exact, A leaf succeed, and another leaf, And all the elements thy puny growth Fostering propitious, thou becam'st a twig. Who lived when thou wast such? Of couldst thou speak, As in Dodona once thy kindred trees? Oracular, I would not curious ask The future, best unknown, but at thy mouth Inquisitive, the less ambiguous past." Tennyson, in his Talking Oak, alludes to the oaks of Dodona in these lines: "And I will work in prose and rhyme, And praise thee more in both, Than bard has honored beech or lime, Or that Thessalian growth, In which the swarthy ringdove sat, And mystic sentence spoke," etc. Byron alludes to the oracle of Delphi, where, speaking of Rousseau, whose writings he conceives did much to bring on the French Revolution, he says: "For the he was inspired, and from him came, As from the Pythian's mystic cave of yore, Those oracles which set the world in flame, Nor ceased to burn till kingdoms were no more." Chapter 35.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, January 2007. Bulfinch's Mythology, The Age of Fable, by Thomas Bulfinch. Chapter 35. Origin of Mythology, Statues of Gods and Goddesses, Poets of Mythology. Origins of Mythology. Having reached the close of our series of stories of pagan mythology, an inquiry suggests itself. Whence came these stories? Have they a foundation in truth, or are they simply dreams of the imagination? Philosophers have suggested various theories on the subject, and one, the scriptural theory, according to which all mythological legends are derived from the narratives of Scripture, though the real facts have been disguised and altered. Thus, Deucalion is only another name for Noah, Hercules for Samson, Arion for Jonah, etc. Sir Walter Raleigh, in his History of the World, says Jubal, Tubal, and Tubal-Cain were Mercury, Vulcan, and Apollo, inventors of pasturage, smithing, and music. The dragon which kept the golden apples was the serpent that beguiled Eve. Nimrod's tower was the attempt of the giants against heaven. There are doubtless many curious coincidences like these, but the theory cannot without extravagance be pushed so far as to account for any great proportion of the stories. 2. The historical theory, according to which all the persons mentioned in mythology were once real human beings, and the legends and fabulous traditions relating to them are merely the additions and embellishments of later times. Thus the story of Aeolus, the king and god of the winds, is supposed to have risen from the fact that Aeolus was the ruler of some islands in the Tyrrhenian Sea, where he reigned as a just and pious king, and taught the natives the use of sails for ships, and how to tell from the signs of the atmosphere the changes of the weather and the winds. Cadmus, who, the legend says, sowed the earth with dragon's teeth, from which sprang a crop of armed men, was in fact an emigrant from Phoenicia, and brought with him into Greece the knowledge of the letters of the alphabet, which he taught to the natives. From these rudiments of learning sprung civilization, which the poets have always been prone to describe as the deterioration of man's first estate, the golden age of innocence and simplicity. 3. The allegorical theory supposes that all the myths of the ancients were allegorical and symbolical, and contained some moral, religious, or philosophical truth or historical fact under the form of an allegory, but came in process of time to be understood literally. Thus, Saturn, who devours his own children, is the same power whom the Greeks called Chronos, time, which may truly be said to destroy whatever it has brought into existence. The story of Io is interpreted in a similar manner. Io is the moon, and Argus the starry sky, which, as it were, keeps sleepless watch over her. The fabulous wanderings of Io represent the continual revolutions of the moon, which also suggested to Milton the same idea. "To behold the wandering moon, riding near her highest noon, like one that had been led astray in the heaven's wide, pathless way." Il Penseroso. 4. The physical theory, according to which the elements of air, fire, and water were originally the objects of religious adoration, and the principal deities were personifications of the powers of nature. The transition was easy from a personification of the elements to the notion of supernatural beings presiding over and governing the different objects of nature. The Greeks, whose imagination was lively, peopled all nature with invisible beings, and supposed that every object, from the sun and sea to the smallest fountain and rivulet, was under the care of some particular divinity. Wordsworth, in his Excursion, has beautifully developed this view of Grecian mythology. "In that fair clime the lonely herdsman stretched on the soft grass through half a summer's day, with music lulled his indolent repose, and in some fit of weariness, if he, when his own breath was silent, chanced to hear a distant strain far sweeter than the sounds which his poor skill could make, his fancy fetched, even from the blazing chariot of the sun, a beardless youth who touched a golden lute, and filled the illumined groves with ravishment. The mighty hunter, lifting up his eyes toward the crescent moon, with grateful heart, called on the lovely wanderer who bestowed that timely light to share his joyous sport. And hence a beaming goddess with her nymphs, across the lawn and through the darksome grove, not unaccompanied with tuneful notes, by echo multiplied from rock or cave, swept in the storm of chase, as moon and stars glance rapidly along the clouded heaven when winds are blowing strong. The traveller slaked his thirst from rill or gushing fount, and thanked the Naiad. Sunbeams upon distant hills gliding apace with shadows in their train, might with small help from fancy be transformed into fleet Oreads sporting visibly. The zephyrs fanning as they passed their wings, lacked not for love fair objects whom they wooed with gentle whisper. Withered boughs grotesque, stripped of their leaves and twigs by hoary age, from depth of shaggy covert peeping forth, in the low vale or on steep mountain side, and sometimes intermixed with stirring horns, of the live deer or goat's depending beard. These were the lurking satyrs, wild brood, of gamesome deities, or Pan himself, that simple shepherd's awe-inspiring god." Unquote. All the theories which have been mentioned are true to a certain extent. It would therefore be more correct to say that the mythology of a nation has sprung from all these sources combined than from any one in particular. We may add also that there are many myths which have arisen from the desire of man to account for those natural phenomena which he cannot understand, and not a few have had their rise from a similar desire of giving a reason for the names of places and persons. Statues of the gods. To adequately represent to the eye the ideas intended to be conveyed to the mind under the several names of deities, was a task which called into exercise the highest powers of genius and art. Of the many attempts, 4 have been most celebrated, the first 2 known to us only by the descriptions of the ancients, the others still extant, and the acknowledged masterpieces of the sculptor's art. The Olympian Jupiter. The statue of the Olympian Jupiter by Phidias was considered the highest achievement of this department of Grecian art. It was of colossal dimensions, and was what the ancients called chryselephantine, that is, composed of ivory and gold. The parts representing flesh being of ivory laid on a core of wood or stone, while the drapery and other ornaments were of gold. The height of the figure was 40 feet, on a pedestal 12 feet high. The god was represented seated on his throne. His brows were crowned with a wreath of olive, and he held in his right hand a scepter, and in his left a statue of Victory. The throne was of cedar, adorned with gold and precious stones. The idea which the artist essayed to embody was that of the supreme deity of the Hellenic Grecian nation, enthroned as a conqueror in perfect majesty and repose, and ruling with a nod the subject world. Phidias avowed that he took his idea from the representation which Homer gives in the first book of the Iliad, in the passage thus translated by Pope: "He spoke, and awful bends his sable brows, shakes his ambrosial curls, and gives the nod, the stamp of fate and sanction of the god. High heaven with reverence the dread signal took, and all Olympus to the centre shook, the Minerva of the Parthenon." This was also the work of Phidias. It stood in the Parthenon, or temple of Minerva, at Athens. The goddess was represented standing. In one hand she held a spear, in the other a statue of Victory. Her helmet, highly decorated, was surmounted by a sphinx. The statue was 40 feet in height, and, like the Jupiter, composed of ivory and gold. The eyes were of marble, and probably painted to represent the iris and pupil. The Parthenon, in which this statue stood, was also constructed under the direction and superintendence of Phidias. Its exterior was enriched with sculptures, many of them from the hand of Phidias. The Elgin marbles, now in the British Museum, are a part of them. Both the Jupiter and Minerva of Phidias are lost, but there is good ground to believe that we have, in several extant statues and busts, the artist's conceptions of the countenances of both. They are characterized by grave and dignified beauty, and freedom from any transient expression, which in the language of art is called repose. The Venus de' Medici. The Venus of the Medici is so called from its having been in the possession of the princess of that name in Rome, when it first attracted attention about 200 years ago. An inscription on the base records it to be the work of Cleomenes, an Athenian sculptor of 200 B.C., but the authenticity of the inscription is doubtful. There is a story that the artist was employed by public authority to make a statue exhibiting the perfection of female beauty, and to aid him in his task, the most perfect forms the city could supply were furnished him for models. It is this which Thomson alludes to in his Summer. "So stands the statue that enchants the world, so bending tries to veil the matchless boast, the mingled beauties of exulting Greece." Byron also alludes to this statue. Speaking of the Florence Museum, he says, "There too the goddess loves in stone, and fills the air around with beauty," etc. And in the next stanza, "Blood, pulse, and breast confirm the Dardan shepherd's prize." See this last allusion explained in Chapter 27. The Apollo Belvedere. The most highly esteemed of all the remains of ancient sculpture is the statue of Apollo, called the Belvedere, from the name of the apartment of the Pope's palace at Rome in which it was placed. The artist is unknown. It is supposed to be a work of Roman art, of about the 1st century of our era. It is a standing figure, in marble, more than 7 feet high, naked except for the cloak which is fastened around the neck and hangs over the extended left arm. It is supposed to represent the god in the moment when he has shot the arrow to destroy the monster Python. The victorious divinity is in the act of stepping forward. The left arm, which seems to have held the bow, is outstretched, and the head is turned in the same direction. In attitude and proportion, the graceful majesty of the figure is unsurpassed. The effect is completed by the countenance, where on the perfection of youthful godlike beauty there dwells the consciousness of triumphant power. The Diana à la Biche. The Diana of the Hind, in the Palace of the Louvre, may be considered the counterpart to the Apollo Belvedere. The attitude much resembles that of the Apollo, the sizes correspond, and also the style of execution. It is a work of the highest order, though by no means equal to the Apollo. The attitude is that of hurried and eager motion, the face that of a huntress in the excitement of the chase. The left hand is extended over the forehead of the hind, which runs by her side. The right arm reaches backward over the shoulder to draw an arrow from the quiver. The Poets of Mythology. Homer, from whose poems of the Iliad and Odyssey we have taken the chief part of our chapters of the Trojan War and the return of the Grecians, is almost as mythical a personage as the heroes he celebrates. The traditionary story is that he was a wandering minstrel, blind and old, who traveled from place to place, singing his lays to the music of his harp, in the courts of princes or the cottages of peasants, and dependent upon the voluntary offerings of his hearers for support. Byron calls him the blind old man of Scio's rocky isle, and a well-known epigram, alluding to the uncertainty of the fact of his birthplace, says, quote, "7 wealthy towns contend for Homer dead, through which the living Homer begged his bread." Unquote. These 7 were Smyrna, Scio, Rhodes, Colophon, Salamis, Argos, and Athens. Modern scholars have doubted whether the Homeric poems are the work of any single mind. This arises from the difficulty of believing that poems of such length could have been committed to writing at so early an age as that usually assigned to these, an age earlier than the date of any remaining inscriptions or coins, and when no materials capable of containing such long productions were yet introduced into use. On the other hand, it is asked how poems of such length could have been handed down from age to age by means of the memory alone. This is answered by the statement that there was a professional body of men, called rhapsodists, who recited the poems of others, and whose business it was to commit to memory and rehearse for pay the national and patriotic legends. The prevailing opinion of the learned at this time seems to be that the framework and much of the structure of the poems belong to Homer, but that there are numerous interpolations and additions by other hands. The date assigned to Homer, on the authority of Herodotus, is 850 B.C. Virgil. Virgil, called also by his surname Maro, from whose poem of the Aeneid we have taken the story of Aeneas, was one of the great poets who made the reign of the Roman Emperor Augustus so celebrated, under the name of the Augustan Age. Virgil was born in Mantua in the year 70 B.C. His great poem is ranked, next to those of Homer, in the highest class of poetical composition, the epic. Virgil is far inferior to Homer in originality and invention, but superior to him in correctness and elegance. To critics of English lineage, Milton alone of modern poets seems worthy to be classed with these illustrious ancients. His poem of Paradise Lost, from which we have borrowed so many illustrations, is in many respects equal, in some superior, to either of the great works of antiquity. The following epigram of Dryden characterizes the three poets with as much truth as it is usual to find in such pointed criticism. On Milton: Three poets in three different ages born, Greece, Italy, and England did adorn. The first in loftiness of soul surpassed, The next in majesty, in both the last. The force of nature could no further go, To make a third, she joined the other two. From Cowper's Table Talk: Ages elapsed ere Homer's lamp appeared, And ages ere the Mantuan swan was heard, To carry nature lengths unknown before, To give a Milton birth, asked ages more. Thus genius rose, and set at ordered times, And shot a dayspring into distant climes. Ennobling every region that he chose, He sunk in Greece, in Italy he rose. And tedious years of Gothic darkness past, Emerged all splendor in our isle at last. Thus lovely halcyons dive into the main, Then show far off their shining plumes again. Ovid. Ovid, often alluded to in poetry by his other name of Naso, was born in the year 43 B.C. He was educated for public life, and held some offices of considerable dignity, but poetry was his delight, and he early resolved to devote himself to it. He accordingly sought the society of the contemporary poets, and was acquainted with Horace and saw Virgil, though the latter died when Ovid was yet too young and undistinguished to have formed his acquaintance. Ovid spent an easy life at Rome in the enjoyment of a competent income. He was intimate with the family of Augustus the Emperor, and it is supposed that some serious offence given to some member of that family was the cause of an event which reversed the poet's happy circumstances and clouded all the latter portion of his life. At the age of 50 he was banished from Rome, and ordered to betake himself to Tomi on the borders of the Black Sea. Here, among the barbarous people and in a severe climate, the poet, who had been accustomed to all the pleasures of a luxurious capital and the society of his most distinguished contemporaries, spent the last 10 years of his life, worn out with grief and anxiety. His only consolation in exile was to address his wife and absent friends, and his letters were all poetical, though these poems, the Trista and Letters from Pontus, have no other topic than the poet's sorrows. His exquisite taste and fruitful invention have redeemed them from the charge of being tedious, and they are read with pleasure and even with sympathy. The two great works of Ovid are his Metamorphoses and his Fasti. They are both mythological poems, and from the former we have taken most of our stories of Grecian and Roman mythology. A late writer thus characterizes these poems: "The rich mythology of Greece furnished Ovid, as it may still furnish the poet, the painter, and the sculptor, with materials for his art. With exquisite taste, simplicity, and pathos, he has narrated the fabulous traditions of early ages, and given to them that appearance of reality which only a master hand could impart. His pictures of nature are striking and true. He selects with care that which is appropriate. He rejects the superfluous, and when he has completed his work, it is neither defective nor redundant. The Metamorphoses are read with pleasure by youth, and are reread in more advanced age with still greater delight. The poet ventured to predict that his poem would survive him, and be read wherever the Roman name was known." The prediction above alluded to is contained in the closing lines of the Metamorphoses, of which we give a literal translation below. "And now I close my work, which not the ire Of Jove, nor tooth of time, nor sword, nor fire Shall bring to naught. Come when it will that day, which o'er the body, not the mind, has sway, and snatch the remnant of my life away, my better part above the stars shall soar, and my renown endure for evermore. Where the Roman arms and arts shall spread, there by the people shall my book be read, and if aught true in poets' visions be, my name and fame have immortality." End of chapter 35.